Yeah, my name's Bruce Howie. I have my own consultancy in extension. It's mostly to do with extension training. So we do short workshops for extension people. My master chef from France, and he's a specialist in steak. And so Philippe is going to serve us our steak on the first night of this opening of the restaurant. And I'm really excited about this. You're all in anticipation. And then lo and behold, as you start to dive into your steak, what I see is some shades coming down over your faces. And I realise I should have thought about this earlier. But if any of you have visited France, you will know how they like to serve their steak in France. And unfortunately, everybody has received their steak really rare. And the problem is, I presume that not all of you like your steak rare, you like it a little bit better done. And so I decide that I'm going to have to work on Philippe if I'm going to have a successful restaurant. And being the scientist that I am, I race out and I gather a few statistics on how people like their steak. And I discover that, yes, there are a few people down there on the margins that like to have their steak rare or even blue, but the majority are somewhere there in the middle. So I try to work this through with Philippe, but Philippe never changes. So what I find is I start to have people coming to my restaurant who only like rare steak, and that's not sustainable for my business. I've either got to get rid of Philippe or my business is going to go out the back door. It's no good just having people who like rare steak. Now, the thing is that most of you have probably seen this graph in a different form, under a different heading. You've probably seen it looking like that, technology adoption curve. You'd all be reasonably familiar with that. And what we realise is that, yes, towards the left-hand side of that diagram, there is a number of people who really are quick to adopt technology. I call them the rare steak people, the early adopters. And it's interesting because we find it really nice working with these people. We love to serve up information and technology. These people are information lovers. And as scientists, we're really good at feeding them what they want. But they're only a small part of the population. But look at some of their characteristics. These people are testing. They like to test new ideas out. They're innovative. They will try to fix things if they don't work properly. And they like to embrace change. These are some of the characteristics that we notice in those people who are early adopters. And you can see why we relate to them pretty well, because they're our kind of people. And so that's something where we have a very good connection with them. Trouble is, most of the people that we want to reach are here in the middle. And what we need to do is think about what it is that they like. They actually have an appetite for something different. And when we look at the characteristics that are common with the mainstream market, what we see are things like this. These people tend to be esteem-driven. They over the fence and scoff at them. These people do worry about what people think about them. They avoid social risk. They are outer-directed. That doesn't mean to say that they want to be told what to do, but they do like to have guidance. They do like to have a framework within which to implement new technologies. They want to belong. They don't want to stand out as individuals out of the crowd. They like to display the symbols of success. I think this is an interesting one. These are the farmers that like to have the big shiny green tractor in the field, or the lovely new expensive storage bin just on the side of the road where everybody can see how good growers they are. So these are very common characteristics of the mainstream market. What this points out to us is some work that was done by Cultural Dynamics, a UK company, and they actually point out that all of us as human beings are driven by values. It's our value system that underpins the decisions that we make. It's not always black and white evidence. Our values are so critical. And what they point out is that our values are tied to make my decision on the evidence that I collect. That's why I do experiments and run trials. But the reality is all of us as human beings make decisions on how the information we receive affects ourselves, our emotions and our values. And so we need to recognise that as part of our extension training programs as well. This is work that was done by the Centre for Food Integrity in the United States here. They identified in their work that shared values are 3 to 5 times the science that I have. And what this work shows me is that I've got to connect at the level of values and identify those factors before people are really going to be tuning into the message that I have in terms of facts. So we can go down the track of rationality and evidence alone, and the consequences of that is that we capture a limited audience. You know, those information-hungry ones, the people who are naturally inquisitive. And that's only a small part of the audience that we want to capture. The danger is, however, if we allow the pendulum to swing too far and go to values and emotions alone, then what we finish up with, we finish up being snake oil salespeople. And what we do is we lose credibility. We need a balance here, and the last point I put there is generate blind passion. And I think you've all seen examples where blind passion leads people down different pathways, and it's really hard to get them back. And we've got all sorts of pressure groups and so on that go down that track without evidence but are driven purely by their emotions and so-called values. I want to take a moment to think about why advertising works. I'm going to look at just 2 advertisements that I want you to reflect on as you look at the characteristics that we identified about the mainstream market. Here's an advertisement for a herbicide. Now just take a quick moment to look at that. There's not very much technical information in that. Can you see all the values messages in that? The happiness, the bright appearance, the sunglasses reflecting, the beautiful crop actually reflecting in the sunglasses. These are aspirational things. These are esteem things. These are things that are targeting the mainstream market. It does not sell the product, but what it does is says, oh, I feel good about that product. It pushes the like button somewhere inside here. That's what it does. Take a look at this advertisement. PharmOz is a farm chemical supply company in Australia. And so their little catchphrase there, PharmOz, protecting what's important to you, is a really important little phrase for them. And look at those lovely crops that you can see there. Aspirational images. Any farmer would aspire to those. And so you can see that they are really targeting the success story. But I've hidden something in that advertisement. There's one more thing in the middle of that which really drives the message home. Now that phrase takes on a totally new emotional meaning, doesn't it? And that is part of the image that they are wanting to create about their company. So what advertising does is it taps into feelings. It creates emotional hooks that align the message with values. And why is that important? Well, let's see what happens with advertising, really. A key function of advertising is to connect people with the emotional values of people. And more often than not, this is a subconscious connection. But the effective advertising actually draws people to the information that we want to share with them. And that's where we have to understand the role of these emotional hooks in terms of communicating science. What we identified earlier in the presentation is that there are a large number of people who are not naturally inquisitive, aren't naturally seeking after information. They have all those other mainstream attributes. What we have to do is capture them. We have to grab their interest through their values, and that will draw them to say, well, how can I find out more about that? How can I become inquisitive about that? And so that's what we're doing in terms of trying to draw people to our programs, attract them to the message that we have. Then we can share our information. Then we have the opportunity to give them the evidence that will support the decisions that we want them to make. To me, it's a very critical step in the whole process. So I want to say just a couple of things about what we've done at Sequel, which is a consultancy that I run, in terms of developing the capture model as a mechanism for assisting people to structure their training programs and their extension activities. There are 5 elements to capture. The first is consultation. And I don't want that to sound trite, but it is absolutely the fundamental basic component of any extension activity. It's engagement with the community. Consultation, which allows us to understand at least 2 things, and I've highlighted those 2 things there. If we want a successful practice change program, we must understand what the operational needs are, and we must understand what the emotional needs are. Because these 2 things drive the next stages of the project. If we understand the operational aspects, we will design experimental work and trial work and research work that will create a package that meets the operational needs, provide credible evidence. If we understand the emotional needs effectively, we will know how to tune those messages to the emotional and values-based needs of the clients that we're trying to reach. Then we get both come together, and we can provide a package which is both evidence-based and sits comfortably with the values of our target audience. That is our goal. The R is to identify and remove or minimise the barriers. And interestingly enough, the barriers fall into 2 categories. They fall into those practical barriers that relate to the operational aspects of a program. Soil's not the right type, the points are not sharp enough on the device, whatever it might be. But the other category of barriers are the mind barriers. We've always done it this way. Why should we change? There are too many risk factors. These are all the mind barriers that are related to the values and the feelings of people. And the last part of this message, and some of my things have just got a little bit offline with the change of system here, but the last thing is to ensure commitment. We don't often do that in delivering extension programs. We leave that to the machinery manufacturers. Again, John Deere goes out there, they measure their success by how many orders they take. How often do we measure our success in extension by how many commitments we achieve to actually do something different? And when we design an extension program, we should always have that as part of our goal, is that we know what we want people to do, and we have a mechanism by which we can ask them to make a commitment to take the next step. Remember, the mainstream audience likes to have some guidance. And if we can put the next step in front of them and invite them to participate in the program. By taking that first step, we actually have them moving along the way. So in conclusion, I just want to make reference to some work that was done a couple of years ago by an Australian academic, Dr. Carmen Lawrence. She reviewed Australian science writing, not the stuff that's written for peer-reviewed journals, but the science that is written for a general audience. And she made many references to the way in which writing is delivered in this context. And she said things like, you know, you find it very rare to find a science writer who can actually write about their passion. They fall into this structured scientific writing format that we're trained to follow. But I just want to draw one particular sentence out of what she wrote, because what we're looking at is trying to achieve change. Our goal is adoption. And what she wrote is this: when the language is stripped bare of emotion, it is also stripped of power, the power to change. If we lose that component that influences people at the heart and the gut level, and we focus purely on the mind and evidence, or the brain and the evidence, we will fail in our ability to achieve change in the mainstream market. And that's the challenge that I want to leave with us, to include those components that draw our audience to the information that we have so that they can properly evaluate it. So thank you very much for listening to our story. That's us, and if I haven't imparted enough emotion, well, I just have to leave my little emoticon with you. So any questions, I'm happy to take them.
In the context of extension, when you say ensure commitment, can you follow up on that a little bit more? And because we're not making a sale.
Yeah.
In some ways we are, but.
Yeah, indeed, we are. In the way I look at the world, when we're looking for practice change, we're selling ideas. We are selling ideas. And so you'll see in that model, there's a lot of similarity to somebody who might go to sales training. And an example that I like to use often is if we're talking to people about some type of practice change that involves some analysis of their soil, for example, then present the story that we have to them, give them the rationale for why we want them to do it, connect with their values, but then we need to have part of our plan is to say, next week we are going to have some people out here collecting soil samples, can we come and take some from your place? Now you can say yes or no, that's all right. You know, I don't mind how you respond to that. But at least in my plan, I am prepared to put the next step at your opportunity. So does that make sense?
Actually, it begs a follow-up question. The days when I used to do a lot of one-on-one visits, that was a natural, although not outright, part of my work. Now when we're talking e-extension and we're reaching people electronically, I see that as being a big challenge. So any thoughts there for help if your main way of communicating with your audience is electronically?
Yeah. Well, you know, I think that electronically, you know, we're looking at a medium by which we can communicate information to people. We first of all have to get them interested. One of the things that worries me about electronic media, if you like, if I can just step back a bit, is that we are collecting the rare stake people, the people who naturally go looking for the information. Okay? So if we want to broaden that, we need to find mechanisms by which we can draw a broader audience into our electronic media. But we also need to construct within that, if our objective is adoption and not just information delivery, we need to devise ways in which we can challenge people to take that next step. And you know, I think if it's part of a structured program, we can do that. But if it's just an off-the-cuff seeking of information, it is much more difficult through the electronic media. I have to agree with you. But I don't think the electronic media is necessarily the the single component by which we achieve practice change.
Any additional questions?
Great to see you, Bruce. I bought into what you've been talking about, but in terms of understanding how to connect with people on that emotional level and their values, you've got to understand a bit about them. What are some things that practically we can do in the extension space to understand what the values are of the people that we're engaging with?
Yeah. There are two things that I think are important here. One is to recognise that we can have a one-on-one interaction with people, and that allows us to draw a lot more information from people. And the key to that then is when we have that interaction, we are in listening mode, not in telling mode. There's a whole set of techniques that most of you are probably aware about of asking the right sorts of questions, open-ended questions that allow people to tell their story and not being judgmental in response and just listening to the story. That's when we draw out that information. But there's another category in terms of the general population when we're not dealing one-on-one. Then we have to go back to recognise some of those things that we identified in the attributes of the mainstream market and use those as more general principles, as Bayer did in their advertisement for the herbicide. You know, they're drawing on those general principles, knowing that they're casting the net fairly wide.
Well, thank you very much for sharing. May have some questions after, but I think our session is now concluded.
Thank you.